The hall was already filling up when she quietly stepped inside. People were talking, laughing, adjusting their clothes, and checking their phones as they waited for the event to begin. Bright lights hung from the ceiling, making everything look more polished than it really was. On one side of the stage stood a slightly old piano, its surface clean but clearly worn with time. Most people did not pay attention to it. They were more interested in the singers and performers who were preparing backstage. She paused near the entrance for a moment, holding the strap of her small bag tightly. Her clothes were simple, neat but not eye-catching. She looked around as if searching for a place where she could quietly sit without being noticed. But something about her eyes suggested she was not there just to watch. She slowly walked along the side of the hall, keeping close to the wall. A few people glanced at her briefly, then looked away just as quickly. To them, she was just another face in the crowd. Someone who had come to pass time, nothing more. Near the middle row, a group of teenagers sat together, laughing loudly at their own jokes. Their voices stood out in the room. As she passed by them, one of them noticed her and nudged the others. They looked at her from head to toe, whispering and smirking. It was not loud enough to draw attention, but it was enough for her to notice. She lowered her gaze and kept walking. At the far corner of the hall, there were a few empty chairs. She chose one and sat down quietly. From there, she could clearly see the piano on stage. Her eyes stayed fixed on it for a long moment, as if nothing else in the room existed. People continued to arrive. The noise in the hall grew louder. The host was moving around, checking arrangements, speaking to participants, and making sure everything was ready. There was excitement in the air, but also a sense of competition. Each performer wanted to stand out. She remained silent, her hands resting in her lap. Every now and then, she would look at her fingers, gently pressing them together as if remembering something. It was a small, almost unnoticeable movement, but it carried a sense of habit. After a while, the event officially began. The host stepped onto the stage with a confident smile and welcomed everyone. The audience clapped politely. One by one, performers were called up. There were singers, a small dance group, and even someone who recited poetry. Each performance received applause, some louder than others. She watched everything carefully, but her attention always returned to the piano. It stood there quietly, unused, like it was waiting for someone. As time passed, the group of teenagers grew louder. They commented on each performance, sometimes praising, sometimes making jokes. They seemed to enjoy being the center of attention among themselves. One of them suddenly noticed her again. "Hey, look!" he whispered to the others, nodding in her direction. "She's been staring at that piano the whole time." Another one laughed softly. "Maybe she thinks she can play." They chuckled among themselves. It started as quiet teasing, but it slowly grew bolder. "Why don't you go and try?" one of them said a bit louder, pretending to encourage her. "Show us your talent." She heard them. There was no way she could not. But she did not react. She simply looked down again, as if the words had passed right through her. Their laughter continued for a few seconds before they lost interest and turned their attention back to the stage. But the moment had already left its mark. She took a slow breath and looked up again at the piano. Another performance ended, and the host returned to the stage. There was a short pause in the program. Some people used this time to stand, stretch, or check their phones. The energy in the room dipped slightly. It was during this moment that she made a decision. She stood up. At first, no one noticed. She was just another person moving through the hall. But instead of heading toward the exit or the side, she began walking straight toward the stage. Her steps were slow but steady. A few people near the front looked at her with mild curiosity. The host also noticed her approaching and seemed slightly confused. This was not part of the program. She stopped near the edge of the stage and waited. The host leaned down slightly. "Yes?" he asked politely, though there was uncertainty in his voice. She spoke softly, almost too softly to be heard over the noise in the hall. He leaned in closer to catch her words. I would like to play," she said. For a moment, the host did not respond. He looked at her, then at the piano, then back at her again. It was clear he was unsure what to do. "This is a scheduled event," he said carefully. "Do you have a registration?" She shook her head. The teenagers who had been watching from their seats noticed what was happening. They leaned forward, their interest suddenly renewed. "Let her play," one of them called out jokingly. "This will be fun." A few people nearby turned to look. Some smiled, thinking it was harmless. Others seemed uninterested. The host hesitated. He looked at the audience, then back at her. There was something in her expression. Not confidence, not fear, but something quiet and steady that made him pause. It was not the kind of look that demanded attention. It was the kind that simply waited. "Just 1 minute," she said softly. The hall was not completely silent, but the moment felt still. The host sighed lightly, then gave a small nod. "All right," he said. "Just a short one." He stepped aside. She climbed the few steps to the stage. Her movements were calm, without any rush. But as she walked toward the piano, the same group of teenagers began whispering again. "This is going to be embarrassing," one of them muttered, barely holding back laughter. "Watch her mess it up," another added. Their words spread in small ripples. A few others in the audience started paying more attention now, curious about what was about to happen. She reached the piano and stood beside it for a second. Her hand gently touched its surface, almost like greeting an old friend. Then she sat down. The bench made a faint sound as she adjusted her position. She placed her hands on her lap and looked at the keys. Up close, they showed signs of age, slightly faded, a few with small marks. But they were still strong, still ready. She took a deep breath. The room was not completely quiet. Some people were still talking, some still distracted. But there was enough attention now for her to feel the weight of their eyes. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes. It was as if the noise around her faded away. Her fingers slowly lifted and hovered above the keys. The teasing voices from earlier still echoed faintly in the background, mixed with the low murmur of the crowd. The host stood to the side, watching with folded arms, unsure of what to expect. She opened her eyes again. Her fingers moved slightly closer to the keys, but then stopped. Tiny pause, so small that most people would not notice it. But in that pause, there was something deep, something unspoken. It was not fear. It was not hesitation. It was something else entirely. And then, she placed her fingers down, just barely touching the keys, as if testing their presence. The hall remained in a half-noisy, half-curious state, balanced between distraction and expectation. No one knew what was about to happen next. Not the host. Not the teenagers. Not the audience. And yet, something in the air had quietly begun to change. Something no one could explain. Something that had nothing to do with appearances or whispers or first impressions. Her fingers rested on the piano, ready. And in that quiet, unnoticed moment, everything was about to shift. Her fingers rested on the keys, but the sound had not yet begun. The hall was still filled with low chatter, small laughs, and shifting chairs. Some people were watching her with curiosity, while others had already lost interest, expecting nothing unusual. In the middle row, the same group of teenagers leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her. One of them smirked and whispered, "Why is she just sitting there? Did she forget how to play already?" Another one chuckled softly. "Maybe she's too scared." Their laughter stayed between them, but it carried enough weight to reach the people sitting nearby. A few others smiled, not out of cruelty, but because they assumed this was going to be awkward. On the stage, she remained still. She adjusted her fingers slightly, pressing one key very softly. The sound was so light that it almost disappeared into the noise of the hall. A few people in the front row heard it, but most did not. The teenagers exchanged looks. "That's it?" one of them said quietly. "That was the big performance?" More soft laughter followed. The host, standing at the side of the stage, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He checked his watch quickly, then looked back at her. He was beginning to wonder if he had made a mistake by allowing this. She pressed another key, then another. Each note was slow, careful, almost unsure. It did not sound like a performance yet. It sounded like someone trying to find their place. The audience remained restless. Some people started talking again, thinking this would not be worth their attention. A woman near the back took out her phone. A man in the corner leaned toward his friend and began a quiet conversation. The teenagers did not hold back anymore. "Come on," one of them said louder this time, clapping his hands slowly in a mocking rhythm. "Play something real." A few people turned their heads toward them, but no one said anything. It was easier to ignore. She heard everything, every word, every laugh, but her expression did not change. She took another slow breath. Her fingers moved again, this time pressing a few notes together. The sound was still soft, but it carried a small hint of structure. It was no longer random. It was the beginning of something. One of the teenagers tilted his head slightly. "Wait. What is she doing?" "Nothing," another replied quickly. "Just pressing keys." But the first one did not laugh this time. He kept watching. On the stage, her shoulders relaxed just a little. Her hands began to move more freely across the keys. The notes were still gentle, but they started to connect. A pattern began to form, quiet but steady. The sound slowly rose above the background noise. Not loud enough to silence the room, but enough to reach a few more ears. A man in the front row looked up from his phone. His fingers paused mid-scroll. He listened for a second, then leaned back in his chair. The woman near the back lowered her phone slightly, her eyes drifting toward the stage. The teenagers were still watching, but their expressions had shifted. The laughter had softened, replaced by mild curiosity. "She's just getting lucky," one of them said, though his voice was less certain now. The melody continued to grow, one note at a time. It was simple, but there was something different about it. It did not try too hard. It did not rush. It moved slowly, like a quiet story unfolding. She was no longer testing the keys. She was playing. Her fingers moved with more confidence now, pressing the keys with a gentle but clear purpose. The sound became fuller, more connected. It began to carry emotion, though it was still subtle. The hall started to feel different. Conversations became shorter. Laughter faded into whispers. People who had not been paying attention began to notice the change. The host straightened slightly, his eyes fixed on her hands. The teenagers stopped talking completely. One of them leaned back, crossing his arms. "Okay. That's not bad," he admitted quietly. Another one did not respond. He was watching more closely now, as if trying to understand something. On the stage, she remained focused. Her eyes stayed on the keys, her expression calm but deeply present. It was as if the rest of the room no longer existed for her. The music continued to build, still soft but stronger than before. Each note felt placed with care. Each pause felt intentional. There was no sign of nervousness anymore, only quiet control. The audience could feel it, even if they could not explain it. A man near the aisle leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His attention was fully on the stage now. A young child in the front row, who had been fidgeting earlier, sat still, watching her hands move across the piano. The shift in the room was slow, but it was real. The same people who had ignored her just minutes ago were now listening. Not because they were told to, but because something in the music was pulling them in. The teenagers exchanged glances again, but this time there were no jokes. "Did you expect this?" one of them whispered. The other shook his head slightly. "No." The melody grew a little stronger. Still not loud. Still not dramatic. But deeper. More certain. Carried a feeling that was hard to describe. Something honest. Something real. The kind of sound that did not ask for attention but earned it quietly. She moved her hands across the keys with increasing ease, as if she had finally found her rhythm. The earlier hesitation was gone. In its place was something steady, something confident but not showy. The host took a small step forward, then stopped. He did not want to interrupt whatever was happening. The room had not gone completely silent yet, but it was getting closer. More people turned their heads toward the stage. More conversations faded away. The energy was changing piece by piece. and she felt it, not through their eyes, not through their reactions, but through the way the air itself seemed to settle. Her fingers continued to move, now forming a clearer melody. It was no longer just a beginning. It was becoming a story, the kind of story that did not need words, the kind that spoke directly, quietly, but deeply. The teenagers sat still now, their earlier confidence gone. One of them rested his chin on his hand, watching carefully. "I think," he started, then stopped. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. On the stage, she pressed a slightly stronger note. It echoed just enough to rise above the last bits of background noise. A few people straightened in their seats. Someone in the back row whispered, "Listen," and slowly, very slowly, the hall began to fall quiet. Not all at once, not dramatically, but naturally, as if the sound of the piano was gently asking for space. And the room was finally starting to give it. Her hands did not stop. Her focus did not break. The music continued, steady and growing. The teasing, the laughter, the doubt. They were still there, somewhere in the past moments of the room. But they were no longer in control. Something else was taking over now. Something no one had expected. And as the melody deepened, drawing more and more attention with each passing second, it became clear that this was no longer just a random moment on stage. It was turning into something that no one in the hall would be able to ignore. And yet, this was only the beginning. The hall was no longer filled with chatter. What had started as scattered whispers and small conversations had slowly faded into a quiet stillness. It did not happen all at once. It happened in layers, as if the sound of the piano was gently covering every other noise in the room. Her fingers continued to move across the keys, no longer hesitant. The soft beginning had grown into something more steady, more certain. Each note flowed into the next, forming a melody that felt simple, yet carried something deeper beneath it. People who had been distracted just minutes ago were now fully present. A man in the front row leaned back in his chair, his arms resting calmly as he listened. His expression had changed. Earlier, he had been checking his phone without much interest in the event. Now, his phone lay forgotten in his lap. Near the back, the woman who had been scrolling slowly locked her screen and placed the phone beside her. Her eyes stayed fixed on the stage, her face relaxed but thoughtful. Even the young child who had been shifting restlessly was now still, watching with wide eyes, following the movement of her hands. On the side of the stage, the host stood quietly, no longer checking his watch. His attention was completely on the piano. The uncertainty he had felt earlier was slowly turning into something else, something like surprise. In the middle row, the group of teenagers sat in silence. The same group that had laughed, whispered, and joked only a few minutes ago. Now, none of them were speaking. One of them leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his eyes focused on the keys. His earlier smirk had disappeared. Another one crossed his arms, but not in a careless way. It looked more like he was thinking, trying to understand what he was hearing. "She's actually good," one of them whispered, almost to himself. No one laughed at that. No one disagreed. On the stage, she remained calm. Her shoulders were relaxed, her posture steady. Her eyes stayed on the keys, but not in a nervous way. It was the kind of focus that came from knowing exactly what she was doing. The music began to change. The soft, simple notes that had started the performance slowly grew richer. The melody became more layered, more expressive. It still carried a gentle tone, but now there was strength in it. It felt like the story she was telling through the piano was unfolding step by step. At first, it had been quiet and uncertain. Now it was growing clearer, stronger, more confident. Her fingers moved faster, but never rushed. Each movement felt controlled, natural, like she had played this many times before, even if no one had ever heard it. The sound filled the hall more completely now, not loud enough to overwhelm, but strong enough to hold everyone's attention. A man sitting near the aisle took a slow breath, as if something in the music had reached him in a way he did not expect. He looked down for a moment, then back at the stage. There was something in the melody that felt familiar, even though no one knew the tune. It was not about recognizing the notes. It was about feeling them. The teenagers exchanged a quick glance, but still did not speak. One of them slightly shook his head, as if surprised by his own reaction. "I didn't think," he started quietly, but stopped again. He could not find the right words. On the stage, her hands moved smoothly from one end of the piano to the other. The rhythm grew more defined, the pauses more meaningful. The music was no longer something that blended into the background. It had become the center of the room. People were not just hearing it. They were listening. The host took another small step closer to the piano, careful not to interrupt. His eyes followed her hands, watching every movement with quiet attention. A soft shift in the melody caught everyone's focus again. It dipped slightly, becoming gentle once more, but this time it carried more emotion. It felt deeper, as if something personal was being expressed without words. The room seemed to breathe with the music. No one moved unnecessarily. No one spoke. Even the smallest sounds, like a chair adjusting or someone clearing their throat, felt out of place now. The teenagers sat completely still. The one who had first made fun of her now looked almost uncomfortable, but not in the same way as before. It was not about embarrassment. It was something else. Something like regret. "She didn't say anything," he whispered softly, almost as if speaking to himself. "Even when we—" He did not finish the sentence. The others understood. On the stage, she remained lost in the music. Her expression had not changed much, but there was something softer in her face now. It was as if she was no longer aware of the audience, or maybe she simply did not care about their judgment anymore. The piano responded to her touch with clarity. Each note rang out cleanly, carrying emotion that did not need explanation. The melody rose again, this time stronger than before. It built slowly, carefully, like something gathering strength. The audience could feel it. A sense of anticipation began to grow in the room. Not the kind that comes from loud excitement, but the kind that comes from knowing something meaningful is about to happen. The man in the front row leaned forward slightly now, his attention even more focused. The woman near the back held her hands together in her lap, her eyes fixed on the stage. The child leaned closer to the edge of their seat. Everyone was drawn in. The music was no longer just sound. It had become a feeling that moved through the room, touching each person in a quiet but powerful way. Her fingers pressed the keys with more strength now, but still with control. The melody grew fuller, richer, more alive. Felt like the story was reaching a turning point. The teenagers noticed it too. One of them sat up straighter. "It's changing again," he said softly. Another nodded, his eyes still locked on the piano. There was no laughter left, no teasing, only attention. On the stage, she took a slightly deeper breath, but her hands did not stop. The music continued to rise, carrying more emotion with each passing second. The room was completely silent now. Not forced silence, not uncomfortable silence, but the kind that happens when everyone is fully present. When no one wants to break the moment. The host slowly lowered his arms, letting them rest by his sides. He was no longer thinking about the schedule, the program, or the time. None of that seemed important anymore. The only thing that mattered was the sound filling the hall. Her hands moved with confidence, creating a flow that felt natural and effortless. It was hard to believe that just minutes ago, she had been sitting quietly in the corner, unnoticed, unheard. Now every eye in the room was on her. Every ear was listening. Every thought was focused on the music. The melody climbed higher, reaching a point where it felt almost too full to hold. And yet, she controlled it. She guided it. She shaped it. The audience followed every note, every shift, every small change in rhythm. No one looked away. No one checked their phone. No one whispered. It was as if the entire hall had become part of the same moment. The same feeling. The same quiet understanding. And as the music continued to build, growing stronger and more powerful with each passing second, it became clear to everyone in the room that what they were hearing was not ordinary. Not something to laugh at, not something to ignore, but something rare, something real, something that had started quietly and was now becoming impossible to forget. The melody continued to rise, filling every corner of the hall with a kind of quiet power that no one had expected. It was no longer just beautiful. It was strong, steady, and deeply moving. The soft beginning had transformed into something full and alive, something that held everyone in place without forcing them to stay. Her fingers moved with complete control now. There was no hesitation left in her hands. Each note came exactly when it needed to, as if she was not just playing the piano, but speaking through it. The audience sat completely still. No one shifted in their seat. No one whispered. Even the smallest sounds had disappeared, as if the entire hall had agreed to protect this moment. The man in the front row leaned forward even more, his hands now clasped together. His face showed quiet focus, but there was also something emotional in his eyes, something he was not trying to hide. Near the back, the woman who had been distracted earlier now looked completely absorbed. Her shoulders had relaxed, and her breathing had slowed. She wasn't just listening anymore. She was feeling every note. The young child in the front row rested their chin on their hands, staring at the piano as if it were telling a story meant only for them. On the side of the stage, the host stood without moving. His earlier uncertainty had completely faded. In its place was something like quiet respect. He did not even think about interrupting now. In the middle row, the group of teenagers sat frozen. The same group that had once laughed and made jokes now looked like completely different people. One of them slowly shook his head, almost in disbelief. "How?" he whispered, barely able to finish the thought. Another one leaned forward, his eyes following every movement of her fingers. "We didn't even give her a chance," he said quietly. There was no response to that. There didn't need to be. On the stage, she remained calm, but the music she created carried something much stronger than calmness. It carried truth. The melody shifted again. This time it became deeper. There was a weight to it now, something that felt like it came from a place far beyond the room. It was not loud or dramatic, but it was powerful in a quiet way that reached people without warning. Her hands moved across the keys with purpose, pressing some notes gently, others with more strength. The balance between soft and strong created a rhythm that felt natural, like breathing. The audience followed every change. A man near the aisle closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound settle in. When he opened them again, his expression had softened. A woman sitting beside him wiped her hands together slowly, as if trying to hold onto the feeling the music was creating. Even the air in the room felt different, heavier but not in a bad way. Full, alive. Her fingers moved faster now, but there was still control in every movement. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt out of place. The melody climbed higher, building tension in a gentle way. It felt like something was about to happen. Something important. The teenagers noticed it too. One of them sat up straight, his earlier relaxed posture gone. "Listen to that," he said softly. Another nodded, his eyes wide now. "It's getting stronger." There was a sense of anticipation spreading through the hall. Not loud, not obvious, but real. People could feel it. The music was pulling them forward, step by step, note by note. On the stage, she took a slightly deeper breath, her shoulders rising just a little before settling again. Her focus never broke. She pressed a series of notes that echoed more clearly through the hall. The sound reached every corner now. There was no escaping it. Not that anyone wanted to. The melody dipped suddenly, becoming soft again. But this softness was different from the beginning. It was not uncertain. It was intentional. It felt like a pause in a story, a moment to breathe before something bigger. The audience leaned into that silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the teenagers sat completely still, their earlier energy replaced by quiet attention. The boy who had first made fun of her lowered his gaze for a moment. His hands rested in his lap, his fingers slightly curled. "She heard us," he said quietly. No one answered him, but they all knew it was true. On the stage, her fingers hovered for just a second before continuing. The melody began to rise again. This time it carried something stronger. something brighter. The notes came together in a way that felt fuller, more complete. It was no longer just a quiet expression. It was becoming something powerful. Her hands moved with confidence, pressing the keys with a balance of strength and control that felt almost effortless. The audience felt the change immediately. The man in the front row straightened his back, his eyes fixed on the piano. The woman near the back leaned forward slightly, her attention sharper than before. The child's eyes widened, following every movement. The host took another step closer without realizing it, drawn in like everyone else. The teenagers exchanged a quick glance, but there was no confusion this time, only understanding. "She's telling something," one of them whispered. Another nodded slowly. "Yeah, it feels like it." The music continued to build. Stronger, clearer, more alive. Felt like it was reaching for something. Something just beyond the moment. Her fingers moved faster now, but still controlled, still precise. Each note connected perfectly with the next. The melody rose higher, filling the space with a sound that felt impossible to ignore. The audience could feel it building toward something. Peak. A moment. Something that would not be easily forgotten. The tension in the room grew, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of tension that made people lean forward, hold their breath, and wait. Wait for what came next. On the stage, she remained steady, her expression calm, her focus unbroken. But the music she created carried all the emotion she did not show. The melody climbed higher still, reaching a point where it felt almost too full to contain. And then, she paused, just for a second. A single, perfect moment of silence. The hall held its breath. No one moved. No one made a sound. Felt like time had stopped. And in that silence, everyone understood. This was not just a performance. This was something deeper, something real, something that had started with doubt and quiet laughter, and had now turned into something powerful enough to change the entire room. Her fingers lifted slightly above the keys, ready, waiting, and in that still moment, it became clear that what was about to come next would leave an impact far greater than anything they had expected. The pause did not last long, but it felt longer than it really was. In that single moment of silence, the entire hall seemed to stop breathing. Every eye was fixed on her. Every thought was focused on what would come next. No one dared to move, as if even the smallest sound could break something fragile and important. Her fingers hovered just above the keys. Then gently, she began again. The next notes came out stronger than before. Not loud in a harsh way, but clear and confident, carrying a kind of energy that instantly filled the room. It was as if the music had crossed a line, moving from quiet emotion into something bold and undeniable. The melody rose quickly, building on everything she had already played. This was no longer a soft introduction. This was the heart of it. Her hands moved faster now, gliding across the keys with a smooth, steady rhythm. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Every movement felt natural, like she had been waiting for this exact moment. The sound grew fuller, deeper. It wrapped around the audience, pulling them in completely. The man in the front row sat perfectly still, his eyes wide now, his earlier calm replaced by clear amazement. His hands tightened slightly together as he listened. The woman near the back leaned forward, her lips slightly parted. She didn't even realize she had moved. The music had drawn her in without effort. The child in the front row smiled without knowing why, their eyes shining as they followed the rhythm. On the side of the stage, the host stood frozen. His earlier role as organizer had completely disappeared. He was no longer thinking about anything except the sound in front of him. In the middle row, the group of teenagers sat in stunned silence. The boy who had first laughed now stared at the stage, his face serious. There was no trace of mockery left. Another one slowly shook his head. This is something else," he whispered. No one answered. They were too focused to speak. On the stage, her fingers moved with incredible flow. They crossed over each other, shifting from one side of the piano to the other with ease. The music felt alive, growing stronger with each passing second. The melody rose higher, reaching a point where it felt powerful enough to shake the silence itself. And yet, it remained controlled, balanced, beautiful. The audience could feel it building toward something final, something big, something that would bring everything together. A man near the aisle took a deep breath, his chest rising slowly. He didn't even notice he was holding that breath until the music pulled it out of him. A woman a few rows behind him pressed her hands together, as if trying to hold onto the feeling. Even those who had come only to pass time were now fully present, completely absorbed in what they were hearing. The teenagers leaned forward without realizing it. One of them whispered, "I didn't think something like this could happen here." Another replied softly, "Neither did I." There was a quiet honesty in their voices now. No pride, no jokes, just truth. On the stage, she played with a kind of quiet strength that did not need to show off. It did not try to impress. And yet, it impressed everyone. Her hands moved faster again, the notes flowing together in a way that felt both powerful and smooth. The rhythm picked up, carrying the music forward with unstoppable momentum. The hall felt full of energy now. Not loud energy, but something deeper, something that lived in the silence between the notes. The melody reached higher and higher, building toward its peak. Everyone could feel it coming. The man in the front row leaned even closer, his eyes locked on her hands. The woman near the back held her breath. The child sat completely still. The host stepped closer to the piano without thinking. The teenagers did not move at all. It was as if the entire room had become part of the same moment. The same feeling, the same rising energy. Her fingers pressed a series of stronger notes, each one echoing clearly through the hall. The sound felt bold now, confident, full of life. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The turning point, the peak. Her hands moved across the keys one last time with full strength and control, bringing the melody to its highest point. And then, with a final, clear note, she stopped. The sound hung in the air for a brief second, then faded. Silence. Complete silence. No one moved. No one spoke. It was not the kind of silence that comes from confusion. It was the kind that comes when something powerful has just ended, and people need a moment to understand it. Her hands rested gently in her lap. She did not look up right away. She simply sat there, calm and still, as if the music was still continuing inside her. The audience remained frozen. The man in the front row blinked slowly, as if returning from somewhere far away. The woman near the back let out a quiet breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The child looked around, as if waiting for someone else to react first. The host stood completely still, his eyes wide. The teenagers stared at the stage, their expressions unreadable. For a second, nothing happened. And then, someone in the back of the hall began to clap. Just one person, a single, clear sound breaking the silence. Then another joined, and another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted. Applause filled the room, loud and overwhelming. People stood up from their seats, clapping with energy that could not be held back. The sound echoed off the walls, filling every corner. It was not polite applause. It was not expected applause. It was real, strong, unstoppable. The man in the front row stood up, clapping with both hands, his face filled with respect. The woman near the back stood as well, her eyes still fixed on the stage. The child clapped excitedly, smiling wide. The host finally moved, stepping forward with a look of disbelief and admiration. In the middle row, the group of teenagers sat frozen for a moment longer. Then one of them stood up slowly. The others followed. They began clapping too, not out of pressure, not because everyone else was doing it, but because they meant it. The boy who had laughed the most looked down for a second before raising his hands and joining the applause. His expression had changed completely. There was no pride left, only respect. On the stage, she finally lifted her gaze. She looked out at the audience, seeing them standing, clapping, cheering. For a brief moment, she looked surprised, as if she had not expected this, as if she had only come to play and nothing more. A small, soft smile appeared on her face. Not a proud smile, Not a showy one. Just a quiet, honest one. She stood up slowly from the bench. The applause only grew louder. People continued to clap, some even cheering now. The sound filled the hall in a way completely different from before. It was no longer about doubt. It was no longer about judgment. It was about appreciation. Pure and simple. And in that moment, the same girl who had walked into the hall unnoticed, who had been laughed at, who had been doubted, now stood in front of a room full of people who could not stop applauding her. The shift was complete, and no one in that hall would forget it. The applause did not stop quickly. It continued, loud and full, filling the hall in a way that felt completely different from before. People were not just clapping, they were reacting to something they had truly felt. She stood near the piano, her hands resting lightly at her sides. For a moment she didn't move. She simply looked at the crowd in front of her, almost as if she was trying to understand what was happening. The sound of clapping echoed through the space, rising and falling like waves. Some people were smiling, some were still in quiet shock, and some looked deeply moved. The man in the front row kept clapping, slower now but with more meaning. His expression had softened, and there was a quiet respect in his eyes. The woman near the back wiped the corner of her eye gently, then continued clapping, her gaze never leaving the stage. The child in the front row clapped with excitement, looking around as if to share the moment with everyone else. On the side, the host finally stepped forward, but even he did not interrupt right away. He waited, letting the applause continue, as if he understood that this moment belonged to her. In the middle row, the group of teenagers stood among the rest of the audience. But unlike others, they were quieter. Their clapping was slower, more thoughtful. The boy who had first laughed looked at her, then lowered his gaze for a second. His hands continued to clap, but there was something else in his expression now, something heavier than before. "I didn't think," he said quietly, but stopped. Another one beside him nodded slowly. "We were wrong," he replied. No one argued. No one tried to defend what they had said earlier. There was nothing to defend. On the stage, she took a small step back from the piano, giving it one last gentle look. Her fingers brushed lightly against its surface, almost like a quiet thank you. The applause slowly began to settle, though it did not fully fade. It softened into a steady rhythm, still strong, still full of appreciation. The host finally raised his hand slightly, signaling for calm. The audience gradually quieted down, though the energy in the room remained. He looked at her for a moment, then turned to the audience. "I think," he began, then paused, searching for the right words. "I don't think anyone here expected this." A few soft laughs came from the crowd, but they were not mocking. They were honest. He continued, "Sometimes we think we understand people just by looking at them. But tonight, we were reminded that we don't." The audience nodded quietly. He turned back to her. "Would you like to say something?" All eyes shifted to her again. For a moment, she stood still, unsure. Then she took a small step forward. She did not rush. She did not try to make it a big moment. She simply stood there, facing the audience. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft. "Thank you," she said. That was all. No long speech. No explanation. Just two simple words. But the way she said them carried more meaning than anything else could have. The audience responded with another round of applause, though softer this time. She gave a small nod, then stepped back. The host smiled slightly, then turned to the audience again, continuing the event. But something had changed. Even as the next performer was announced, the energy in the hall was not the same. People were still thinking about what they had just seen. The next performance began, but it did not hold the same attention. Not because it was bad, but because the moment before had left a mark. In the middle row, the group of teenagers sat down again, but they were not as loud as before. They didn't joke. They didn't laugh. They sat quietly, their thoughts somewhere else. After a while, one of them spoke softly. "Do you think she's still here?" Another one looked around. "Maybe." They hesitated for a moment. Then one of them stood up. "I'm going to find her." The others looked at him, surprised, but did not stop him. He walked slowly toward the side of the hall, glancing around. Near the exit, he saw her. She was standing quietly, holding her small bag again, just as she had when she first arrived. She looked the same, simple, calm, unnoticed by most people passing by. He paused for a second, unsure of what to say. Then he walked closer. She noticed him and looked up. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then he took a breath. I just wanted to say, he started. His voice not as confident as before. You played really well. She gave a small nod. Thank you. There was a short silence again. He shifted slightly, then added, and, I'm sorry, for earlier. Her expression did not change much, but there was something gentle in her eyes. It's okay, she said softly. He looked a bit surprised, as if he had expected something more. But she did not say anything else. She didn't need to. He nodded slowly, then stepped back. Still, he said, you were really amazing. A small, quiet smile appeared on her face again. Thank you, she repeated. He gave a slight smile in return, then turned and walked back. When he returned to his group, the others looked at him. Well? One of them asked. He sat down and shrugged lightly. She's normal, he said. They looked confused. He added, but not really. They understood what he meant. On the other side of the hall, she quietly walked toward the exit. No one stopped her. No one made a scene. Most people were still focused on the event, or lost in their own thoughts. She stepped outside into the cool evening air. The noise from the hall faded behind her. The world outside felt calm, simple. She took a deep breath and looked up for a moment. Then she adjusted the strap of her bag and began to walk. There was no crowd around her now. No applause. No attention. Just quiet streets and soft sounds of the night. But something had changed. Not in her. She was still the same. Quiet. Calm. Simple. But the world she had stepped into that evening had seen something it did not expect. Something it almost missed. And for those who had been in that hall, the memory would stay. Not just of the music, but of the moment they realized they had been wrong. The moment they learned not to judge too quickly. The moment a quiet girl, sitting at an old piano, changed the entire room without saying much at all. And long after the sound of the piano had faded, the feeling remained.